Hello, welcome back to this video series on research methods and writing. In this video, I'm going to go through some examples, short descriptions of examples of studies, research studies. Some of these are real, some of these are kind of hypothetical. This is an exercise in my writing textbook, and I'm going to just go through them. If this were a normal class, I would have had you classify them as an exercise and in-class activity, but can't do that right this semester. I'm just going to talk through these as examples in the book. So I'm going to basically explain how the research would be set up, in some cases how a paper might be structured, as examples of different kinds of research, qualitative, quantitative, etc. So the first one, a statistical analysis of the spread of a new viral disease using a novel or new statistical method to model its spread in Korea. So this, of course, is a quantitative paper. It's going to probably start by giving some specific medical background about the disease. This is not about coronavirus. This is about a previous small outbreak. I think it was a SARS outbreak some years ago. And then the researchers briefly explain the statistical method, and they describe, so there's the introduction, there's a little lit review, maybe on recent studies on spread of this particular kind of virus or disease in other countries, recent studies. Then they talk about how they're going to do their experiment, and then the experimental section, they're going to talk about how their experiment was set up. This is based on real data, so it's not like an experiment that was set up and then conducted, but they are actually, it's experimental in the sense that they are looking at existing data, health data, like from the government, medical authorities, and applying, and they explain their statistical model and the statistical results. And then in the discussion section, they explain kind of what it means and how this is a cool model and helps us better understand the spread of this virus than some of the previous statistical models and methods. So that's a quantitative paper. It's kind of after the fact or post hoc, so to speak, using existing data that were already collected about a virus outbreak. Number two, an analysis of themes in the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop using queer theory. So right there, you kind of suggest that this is an interpretive paper, as are many papers in literature studies. Queer theory is a particular literary theory for examining gay, lesbian issues, influences in writing, the characters or the authors. So it would probably kind of flow topically, giving a little background on the particular poems that the writer wants to look at. And then two, maybe talk about some things in the poet's personal letters. The researcher probably went to an academic library where the poet's personal writings are stored. And the author of this paper is going to talk about some things in the personal letters of the bishop that are relevant, and then next, some biographical details in the life of the poet, and then look at examples in the poems that reflect these things that are mentioned in the letters and the biography of the poet. So it's kind of a loosely structured, kind of more very topically organized kind of paper. It's an interpretive paper. Three, an analysis of several case studies from the failures of Microsoft in different markets. And there are many. Microsoft is really, they're good at making money, but they're a failure as business innovators. So this is a case study, a business case study, and this is a sort of qualitative business research paper. Case study itself is kind of in-depth look at, say, what a particular company has done, and this could be kind of purely chronological. They entered this market, and then this market, and this market, and then this market started to go down, this market started to fail, and this market started to fail. Or it could be topical, like their entry into this market, and then how they messed it up, and how they failed and got out of it. Then this market, and how they entered, and they messed it up and got out, and this market, and so on. So it could be topical or such. Different ways of organizing it, depending on your purposes. In the process, the writers would probably apply some kind of model or theoretical framework or theory in order to analyze why Microsoft did this, why they failed, why they kept doing this, why they kept failing, and such. But it's so it's kind of qualitative. You're applying an existing theory to explain kind of holistic qualitative data. 4, statistical analysis of vocabulary errors of language learners in their writing samples. Pretty much tells you it's a quantitative paper. So again, it's probably going to follow a very traditional quantitative layout. Literature review on the similar research on this very same kind of topic, the kind of errors that the researchers are looking at. Then a description of the experiment, how they got the writing samples, probably from an existing collection of writing samples or one that they compiled themselves, and how they did it. The statistical techniques that they used in the analysis, and then their discussion, interpretation of what it means, how it proves a particular hypothesis that they laid out in the beginning. 5, longitudinal studies. So longitudinal means a long-term study, and these are usually quantitative studies. Foreigners in Korea and their language proficiency learning Korean. So this is a statistical analysis. You're going to maybe give them Korean proficiency tests every so often, like every year, half year, and track them, at least those who stay in Korea. And at least for the data you have, maybe some stay for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, whatever. And that's something you can, of course, control for in your statistics. And this would begin with maybe a research hypothesis, or probably a hypothesis, a specific hypothesis about what you might expect to find. And background literature review, that is, how the experiment was set up, how subjects were found, how they were tested and tracked, and the statistical analysis and the results, interpretation, implication, what it means for the hypothesis or theory. 6, an evaluation of educational program using interviews with different people and outcomes and criteria, expected criteria. The criteria can maybe come from some government standards or some theoretical model or something. So this is evaluative. This is evaluative research where you're evaluating the effectiveness of a program. That's pretty clear cut. You're applying criteria. This is what should have happened. These are learning outcomes, results that we would expect, and these are how well these outcomes or expectations were met. How well did students do? How well did they learn? Using different criteria. And there are all kinds of different data that can be used here. Some kind of model for how students should learn and what they should learn. Test scores, so some quantitative data, test scores, some qualitative data, like a lot of interview data with different types of people involved in this study. 7, critique of the language used by a group of politicians to look for hints of racism, bias, discrimination, etc. So this is a critical study, kind of like the critical evaluative approach. Maybe using, for example, a theory like critical discourse theory, which is an applied linguistics theory that deals with how things like racism, bias, discrimination, sexism might be expressed, even though in subtle, minor ways in language, and using that theory to apply to kind of critique and analyze politicians in their speech and their writings for hints of bias. So that's a critical evaluative study, critiquing them. 8, a stylistic analysis on an anonymous poem to determine if it might have been written by William Shakespeare. So kind of a theoretical and interpretive or qualitative. It has aspects of qualitative research using probably a stylistic theory, some theory of style. Might have elements of theoretical and interpretive too. Of course, you're using a theory anyway. But the data are qualitative. It's a poem, and you're using some kind of a theory, a qualitative theory. So you could argue that this is interpretive. You could argue that it's qualitative, has elements of both. There are elements of interpretive in some degree in different kinds of qualitative studies anyway. But mainly I would say this is qualitative. If you said interpretive, I would accept that too. I think it's qualitative because you're probably using some stylistic theory of style and language, and qualitative data about Shakespeare and his writing patterns in his known works to find kind of enough correspondences and similarities in style and vocabulary and structure and such. So sort of qualitative, linguistic, literary study. 9. Conversational data from actual conversations are transcribed and analyzed. This is qualitative. This is a field of linguistics called discourse analysis, or conversational analysis, actually, conversation analysis, where you record natural conversations and you make very, very, very detailed transcriptions, including like pauses and how long the pauses are, and where one person stops talking, the next person starts talking, their turn taking, intonation patterns, very detailed transcription. And then you look for patterns and you have some sort of a research question like, how are they using certain expressions to accomplish their goals? How are they using certain forms or style or other linguistic elements for interaction? So you start with a research question like, how are they doing something? It's not so much a research hypothesis, but a research question. How are they using something, some language element? And it's going to be loosely structured. You might look at maybe one aspect, like it might be topical. Here's one aspect of the conversation, citing excerpts from different parts of the conversation. And here's another aspect, another subcategory, and another subcategory, or it could just go straight through section by section and point out different interesting things, and then pull them all together, synthesize them, put them together in a more of a general comprehensive analysis afterwards, and come to some conclusions. Next, acoustic data are taken from Chinese speakers and their dialect. Look for changes in tone changes between older and younger speakers, because if you study Chinese dialects, phonetics, over decades, you might see slight changes in the tone patterns in a particular dialect. This is quantitative. You're measuring like frequencies of their tones and tone patterns and comparing them between older and younger speakers. There's a statistical comparison, and see if there are any pronunciation changes going on. In case you don't know Chinese, standard Chinese Mandarin has like 4 tones, 5 tones, 4 tones and a neutral tone, but different dialects have very complicated tone patterns, and they've been known to change slightly, over decades and generations and such. So this is a quantitative study. So we've got a lot of phonetic data, statistical comparisons, and then your analysis and conclusions about changes in tone pronunciation from older to younger generations in this area. Next, a language classroom is observed, and the researchers, so observational data, ethnographic, educational research. The researcher is using a particular social theory of language. So that's all another cue that it is qualitative. It's ethnographic qualitative research using some theory to kind of look for and assess social interaction, different kinds of social interactions. So you might have kind of some comments on different interesting interactions that were involved, the ethnographic data itself. Then this mentions some interviews afterwards. So then you got interview data, and then a general analysis where you bring it all together and talk about hints of attitudes in the data about students' attitudes, teachers' attitudes, towards some aspect of language learning. Now, you may be thinking qualitative and interpretive seem to overlap. Sometimes they do. Here, you've got a research question, and you're mainly exploring. So qualitative is mainly exploratory. You've got a research question, and you're exploring something. So you might think that qualitative sounds kind of like interpretive, critical, and evaluative approaches. And actually, the critical, evaluative, and interpretive approaches in some ways are sort of variants of qualitative research. With general qualitative research, you start with a general research question, and it's more exploratory. And you explore the data. So it's kind of open-ended from the beginning. Qualitative is more open-ended from the beginning. With critical and evaluative, a lot of the data might be qualitative, or it might be a mixture of qualitative and quantitative data, but your approach is more like I'm using a theory to a theory or model or criteria in order to critique or evaluate something. So does something conform to a particular set of standards or criteria? You're looking to see if something conform to certain criteria or standards. Interpretive is also a bit similar in some ways to a lot of qualitative research, but you're more concerned with interpreting something, using a theory to identify something that's not so obvious, whether it's attitudes that are kind of hidden in the language, using some critical theory of language use, or looking for hidden or less obvious signs of, say, bias or discrimination in some kind of system. Critical, evaluative, and interpretive have more specific goals in mind, and their approaches are kind of more specialized compared to general qualitative research. So, last one, interview data are collected from students about their attitudes toward learning English. And there's close-ended and objective survey items for statistical comparison and open-ended interviews for qualitative analysis. So this is a mixed method study. So there's some qualitative data and quantitative data together in one study. So you've got a classroom setting. There are quantitative survey questions which are analyzed statistically. Maybe not an extremely detailed statistical analysis, because there's also a qualitative data set with some open-ended interviews where you ask them about, what do you think? Open-ended questions. What do you think about this? How did you feel about this? What are your attitudes about this? That's a mixed method study. And that's also kind of common in language education studies. Okay, so these are some examples which hopefully help you to better understand some of the research methods and approaches. Sometimes there's some overlap. Some of these other types, the critical, evaluative, interpretive approaches, are in some way similar to the qualitative and maybe the theoretical, but have special purposes and special techniques that are used, special research techniques that are used that are different from the standard qualitative methods. So I'm not too concerned if you be able to that you can distinguish qualitative from interpretive, from critical, evaluative. That's not so important. What I'm more interested in is that at least you can kind of identify general research methods and approaches and understand how the research is going to be done as a result of the purpose of the researchers, or maybe your own research if you're writing your own paper for a class, and how that's going to shape the writing, the kind of support you give to support your points, your main ideas in the paper, how you're going to communicate to the reader, and what kind of reader you're communicating to. Who's your audience? Is your audience expecting a very scientific style paper with statistical comparison and proving a hypothesis? Are you writing for that kind of reader? Is that what you're interested in as a researcher or as the writer of a paper in a class? Are you more interested in doing more of a holistic qualitative description and exploring a research question, not necessarily deciding on this is a hypothesis is correct or not, but exploring a question, and you're interested in writing to a group of people with similar interests? They just want to explore an interesting question, an issue. Or is your purpose to critique, evaluate, or interpret something? And is that the kind of audience that you're writing to? Or we didn't really have any theoretical examples, but are you more of a theoretical thinker and you want to communicate to other theoretical people about interesting theoretical questions? Questions that are theoretical, that are interesting to you and to people like you. Those are some things to think about as you are, if you're in my class, you're going to be doing an assignment about this kind of stuff. So some things to think about in terms of maybe what kinds of papers do you want to select for the assignment, or what kind of papers do you want to use as sources for your final paper in my class or the paper you're writing in another course. So, hope that was helpful. A little dry, but hopefully helpful. So, that is it for today, for now. I will see you in the next video. So take care and goodbye.